Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in this world. This is John West, back with you with Japanese Business and Economy. Yes, John West, back with you with Japanese Business and Economy. Today we'll look at Class 4B, the second part of Class 4. We'll look at Japan's demographic drama. Now, in our previous class, we looked at Japan's bubble economy, the big rise in housing prices, the stock market through the 1980s that burst in the early 1990s. Now, after the bubble economy popped, Japan began its lost decades of economic stagnation. But there was another factor that was behind Japan's lost decades, and that is Japan's demographic drama, its rapidly aging population. Now, Japan's working age population has been declining since 1995. This weakens the economy, less and less workers in the economy. It weakens the government budget and debt as the government pays more money on pensions and healthcare. It also weakens the country in its international relations at a moment when China is rising and the US a bit erratic. Now, Japan's working age population has been falling since 1995, from 87 million to 75 million today. And looking out to the end of the century, 2100, it could fall to 43 million. On top of that, Japan's total population started falling in the year 2010. And it could fall from 127 million today to 85 million at the end of the century. Now, in Japan, life expectancy has also risen from just 63 in 1950 to 84 today, could rise to 94 by the end of the century. This is a very positive development. Rising life expectancy means longer lives, we're living longer. But it also costs the government budget through pensions and healthcare for seniors. Now, old age dependency is a very interesting statistic. You see in this chart that Japan's old age dependency ratio has been rising. Now, what this means is the ratio of seniors, people over 65, compared with people of a working age population, 15 to 64. And of course, the more seniors you have compared with the working age population, the more that seniors are a weight on the economy. Now, back in 1950, seniors were only 8% of compared with the working age population. So for every 100 workers, there was only 8 seniors. So the weight of seniors on the economy was quite low. By the year 2015, it actually risen to 43%. So you had for every 100 people of working age, working in the economy, there were 43 seniors being supported in the economy. And by the end of the century, it could rise to 69%. So that would mean for every 100 people of working age, working in the economy, there was another 69 of seniors over 65 being supported by the economy. So this weight of the old age dependency is a very important factor in the effect of seniors on the economy. Now, what is the main driver of Japan's demographic drama? In fact, it is the falling fertility of Japanese women over the years. Now, Japan's fertility rate fell from over 4 children per woman in 1950, you can see in the chart here, the red line, down to around 2 in 1970. Then from the mid-1970s, it fell below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman, and today there's around 1.4. Now, demographers talk about the replacement rate. What this means is that if every woman has 2.1 children on average, we're replacing our population over time and the population is constant. But when the fertility rate is below 2.1, Over time, we have a declining population, and over time, we ultimately disappear. And so Japan's aging population is mainly driven by this decline in the fertility, and fertility being below the replacement rate for such a long time. Now, Japan is often presented as a strange, unusual case with its low fertility, but in fact, it's not so strange at all. Japan has been merely leading the world in a worldwide trend. Today, half the world's population lives in countries with fertility rates less than 2.1. And you see in this chart here that in Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea all have fertility rates below Japan, but their fertility rates fell below the replacement rate much more recently than Japan. And in the case of Singapore and Hong Kong, one thing that distinguishes them from Japan is they have very large immigrant populations. What causes Japan's low fertility? In Japan, the decline in fertility is associated with a decline in marriage. And due to socially conservative attitudes in Japan, unmarried women rarely have babies, in contrast to the West. And so why are Japan's marriage and fertility rates so low? As economists look at the problem, they see it in the following way. As Japanese women are now better educated and more interested in working, despite discrimination in the workplace, but it is difficult for Japanese women to combine work and family life when corporate life in Japan is characterized by long working hours, compulsory overtime, socializing with colleagues, and transfers to offices far from home. So what happens is that some women choose work over marriage and family. And so, and even if a woman just postpones having a family, she may settle for just one child rather than two. Indeed, today, the average woman's age for having the first child is over 30 years old. What we need is for Japanese corporations to have a more family-friendly work culture and more efficient work practices. We'll come back to this later in the class. There are other factors, though, behind the decline in marriage and the decline in fertility in Japan. One factor is the rise of low-paid irregular employment. And we looked at that in a previous class. What happens is that young boys who get low-paid irregular jobs simply cannot afford to get married and start a family. So you see in this chart that the shift to non-regular employment from even just back in the year 2002, it was below 30% non-regular employment. Now it's up to close to 40%. So with more and more people having these non-regular jobs, and these non-regular jobs are low paid compared with more permanent jobs, people in such jobs have very low salaries and can't afford to get married and start a family. But more fundamentally in Japan, we have a country that has changed so much in terms of its society, politics, and economy. And one of the fundamental things is that in Japan, Japanese women are much more well educated than they were in the past, and they are now much more in control of their lives. And they are able to choose whether or not to get married and have children. And so some people say that Japanese women, being in control of their lives, are now rejecting the traditional gender division of labor and would prefer not to get married. There are other factors. Japan's poor work-life balance means that men have little time to contribute to family life and thereby support women in their wish to have work and have a family. In Japan, women devote nearly 4 hours a day to housework and childcare, compared with men who can devote less than 1 hour. Look at this chart here. The top bars, that's during weekdays, that's the number of hours that Japanese women devote to housework and childcare. The green bar, that's husbands. And it's easy to be critical of Japanese men here, but part of the reality is that Japanese men working such long hours that they have very little time to devote to the housework and childcare. Look at this Japanese gentleman here. He looks so happy. And so what we need to have is a more family-friendly working environment so that Japanese men have more time for working at home. And maybe like this gentleman, they'll be much more happy than otherwise. Now, an interesting thing in Japan is that Japan has very high paternity leave. When people have a family, have babies, they can take time off work. And for Japanese men, the paternity leave law is the most generous in the world, the highest in the world. But the reality is, because of work pressures, very few Japanese men take paternity leave. Other factors that reduce the fertility rate in Japan is the high cost of housing in Tokyo, the world's biggest city. Another thing we saw in an earlier class is night school, or juku. In Japan, there's enormous pressure to go to night school, to pass your exams and so on, but this costs. So having a family is expensive with the cost of housing, cost of education, night school. A chronic problem we've seen over the years in Japan is the lack of preschool and daycare places. Now, the government has put lots of effort into improving the situation and providing more places, but there is still today, as we sit here today, about 20,000 Japanese children on waiting lists for preschool or daycare. And of course, a young family that has children who can't get into preschool or daycare means that the mother usually or often has to look after the children and therefore can't go to work. Now in Japan, sociologists also look at the problem of Japan's low fertility, and they talk about the idea that Japan might have a celibacy syndrome.
They're young and single, dateless, but not desperate. Japan's 20 to 30-somethings are not interested in sex. The country is suffering from sexual shinai shokugon, or celibacy syndrome. With some of the lowest birth rate figures on record, there's more people over 65 and less people under 15 in Japan than anywhere else in the world. The country is experiencing the steepest population decline on the planet. It sits at 126 million right now, but that's consistently shrunk over the past decade. This ticker, developed by local researchers, shows Japan's population drops by 1 person every 10 seconds. The dip so serious that the nation could perish into extinction within 1,000 years, unless young people start reproducing more. The number of single people has just reached a record high. A bunch of recent studies found nearly 50% of Japanese women aged 18 to 34 are single. Weirdly, men are supposed to be at their hormonal prime in that same age bracket. But no. More than 60% of Japanese men of the same age don't have a girlfriend or a wife. One report says that at least 1/3 of people under 30 have never been on a date. It's probably a good time to point out we're talking about heterosexuals. There's no data on same-sex relationships, and it seems they've all got a bit of lackluster libido. The Japan Family Planning Association found that 45% of ladies between 16 to 24 despised sex. More than 1/4 of men felt the same way, and more than 40% of Japanese marriages are classed as sexless. If we look at what's going on between the sheets in other countries, the Japanese might as well be a nation of asexuals. A recent global sex survey of 26 countries found that 53% of adult Americans and 82% of Brazilians consummate at least once a week, compared to only 34% of Japanese. So why is this generation so turned off getting laid? Some say it's because of changing gender roles, creating a new breed of women who no longer want to stay at home. In the past 2 decades, Japanese women have become more independent and more career-driven, leaving no time to fit men in. Others blame the men, a generation obsessed with anime girls and cybersex, or spending their money on the latest tech toys, not real women.
いません。なんかこう実際手に余るそのおもちゃとかグッズとかカードとか買ってる方が好きなんで。
All round, experts fixated on this phenomenon say Japanese ladies and gents have fewer shared goals and less in common than ever before. Whatever the case, if they don't start hooking up soon, it could be sayonara for Japan.
So a very interesting and amusing report on Japan's so-called celibacy syndrome. And it is true that Japan, until recent decades, was a very traditional country, and Japan's society is changing in many ways, and the roles that men and women play in the society is changing. And this may well be a factor behind the decline in Japan's fertility rate. Let's look at another report on Japan's younger generation and the effort to meet up with one another and form relationships.
By Justin McCurry, our correspondent in Tokyo, who's going to give us all the latest stories.
The national anthem, Kimi ga yo, at school closings, not to sing it, but when those ceremonies defy them.
Okay, some pretty strict rules there. Elsewhere, though, in Japan, Justin, the authorities seem less worried about people singing the national anthem and more concerned about the low marriage and birth rates. And that's the subject of today's Asia Live report. Tell us more about the latest initiatives there.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's not unusual to meet one's future wife or husband at work or in a bar or at a club, but concern here in Japan about the low birth rate and the low marriage rate, which is a cause of that low birth rate, and Japan's skewed demographics, mean that even Buddhist temples are getting in on the matchmaking act. At first sight, it looks like a traditional Buddhist ceremony. There are prayers and misogi, or ritual purification beneath an ice-cold waterfall. But these Japanese singletons are here not to seek spiritual enlightenment, but to find a partner.
I don't know if I'll meet someone today, but I feel refreshed after the waterfall. And I hope to talk to people who share my interest in temples. It's a good start.
The idea that love can be found at a Buddhist temple is spreading in Japan. For €45 a head, dozens of men and women get to meditate beneath the waterfall and pray that they'll find a soulmate. Then the participants get to know each other over dinner.
When people stand beneath the water, their individual personalities come to the fore. We can tell just by looking at them whether a particular man or woman is special.
Japanese companies, and yes, even temples, are trying to find ways to bring single people together to address the declining marriage and birth rates. A recent survey found that 50% of women and more than 60% of men aged 18 to 34 are single.
Studies show that only 5% of marriages have been arranged the traditional way since 2005. In the old days, arranged marriages were the norm, but now that tradition has gone, some are trying to devise other ways for people to meet.
Machikon is another possible solution to Japan's low marriage rate. In many cities, hundreds and sometimes thousands of single people spend afternoons hopping between bars and restaurants in search of a partner. These organized matchmaking events have succeeded in bringing people together, and they're good for the local economy too.
In Japan, after the tsunami, people saw their purchasing power drop, so they were eating out less. I wanted to find a way to boost local commerce and for people to have fun. That's why I launched these events.
With the help of Sony, the event's organizers have designed an electronic bracelet that improves the participants' chances of finding their ideal partner.
Really, there should be an equal number of men and women at each venue. The bracelet lets them know in real time how many men and women are at each place, so they can quickly decide the best place to go next.
If it works on a grand scale, this initiative could also help to slow the aging of Japanese society. Unless the birth rate increases significantly in the coming decades, Japan could see its population drop by a third by 2060.
All right, that's it for today's Asia Live from Japan. Thanks very much.
So another interesting, entertaining report, but a report into how Japan's society has changed. And as the government official mentioned, if you go back a few decades, arranged marriages were the norm in Japan. And that's less and less the case. And so young people need to find a way to meet each other, to get together and get married and form families. And so there are many institutions involved in trying to improve matchmaking, and certain government organizations, private enterprises, and even Buddhist temples. I have another interesting report for you here on Japan's super solo culture, which may be another factor behind the decline in Japan's fertility rate.
How do you manage risk when the world seems upside down? With products and tools that support your strategy every step of the way. Billions of data points, every major asset class, across the full trade.
一人様っていうのは、一人でご飯を食べに行ったりとか、一人で遊びに行ったりとか、いろんなところに一人で行くっていうのを全般を指します。人と予定を合わせる必要がないだとか、自分の行きたいところにフットワーク軽く、もう行きたいと思った瞬間に行けるとか、そういったメリットがあるのでやってます。覚えてるのはラーメンを一人で大学生になって食べに行ったのが多分最初なんじゃないか。当時の日本では女の子が一人でラーメンに行くっていうのがすごく珍しかったんですね。なのでお店に入るまで結構ドキドキはしました。やっぱ日本人特有のみんなと違うことしちゃいけないかもしれないって思ってしまうような感覚っていうのがやっぱベースとしてあって、一緒に行動してみんなでご飯食べに行くのに私だけ一人でご飯食べに行くっていうみんなと違うことをやっている、これっていけないことなんじゃないかなっていうふうに思い込んじゃうんですね。今日本でお一人様は、昔と比べてやっぱ人気は出てきていると思います。昔からやりたい人自体は多かったと思うんですよ。お一人様って言葉が流行ったりとか、そういう言葉が出てくることによって、私もこういうのやりたかったんだ、実はやっていいんだっていうふうに思えてちょっと増えてきたっていう現象なんじゃないかなと思います。
昔はカラオケというのは大人数で楽しく飲んで歌ってというレジャーだったんですけども、年を追うごとにですね、少人数化して楽しむレジャーに変わってきております。一人の需要というのが、だんだん3割、4割と増えていったような形です。そこで我々としては一人専用のカラオケを作るという事業を立ち上げまして、一人でヘッドホンで楽しむような新しいタイプのカラオケボックスを作りました。一人で時間を使って楽しむという思考というのがだんだん大きくなっていったんじゃないかなというふうには我々は感じております。
一人で歌いたい気分で、数人だとなんかその順番があったりしてちゃんと歌えないと恥ずかしいとかあるんですけど、一人だとやっぱ気兼ねなく歌えるかなと思って、その一人で来ている時は自分の趣味に合った曲を歌うんですけど、やっぱみんなといる時はみんなが知ってるような、みんなが盛り上がれる曲を歌っています。やっぱ違う好きがあるんですけど、やっぱり歌うってことに関しては一人の方が楽しくて好きですね。頭で分かっては嘆いた、何者にもなれないで。
元は逆でした。月に1、2回ぐらいのペースで来させていただいたんですけども 知らない人と、おしゃべりできるっていうのが、一番楽しいなって思うようになって、特定のコミュニティ以外で自分を出したいとか楽しみたいなっていうのがあるんじゃないかなって思ってるんですけど、ほぼ一人のですね、割と。もちろんお友達もいるんですけど、友達いないやつみたいな偏見の目があっても、大丈夫なんだみたいな。どういう取り立たされ方をしてもやってる人いるから、私も大丈夫かなみたいな。将来、パートナーができたり結婚しても、ちょっとお一人様での行動を続けられたらいいかなと私自身は思ってます。
So another interesting report on how Japan's super solo culture is a new societal phenomenon in Japan. And of course, this may also be affecting the tendency for young people to get together, get married, and have families, and therefore affecting Japan's fertility rates. Now, something else that is relevant and people talk about in Japan is the rise of herbivore men who are less masculine than the samurais of generations ago.
Hey guys, it's Kay from Asian Boss. Whenever the mainstream media discusses the issue of low birth rate in Japan, they just can't seem to stay away from the perception that Japan is sexless. We previously did a street interview on this subject, so check out for yourself if Japanese people agree with this perception. In this video, we're going to find out if Japanese men are to be blamed for the sexless trend. Are Japanese men too passive and feminine? Is this negatively impacting dating in Japan? Well, let's see what people have to say.
日本では、草食系男子っていう言葉があるんですけど、それってどういう意味か教えてもらえませんか？
自分からガツガツいかないで、ちょっとなよなよしてる感じ。
こう一歩を踏み出してくれるのを待ってる男子。
草食系男子ってなんかこういうの典型的な格好とか振る舞いとか、なんかありますか？
服装で言ったらそんな勝ち気じゃない感じが多いかなって思います。
ジェルを髪の毛につけたらもう全然肉食ですね。でも俺みたいにガタイがいいとそういう肉食っぽいんですけど、ひょろいのはやっぱ草食ですね。
遅い。体が遅い。体が遅い。結構トレンド取り入れてる感じ。
振る舞い方とかはどうなんですかね？どういう感じで違うんですか？
草食は割り勘だけど、その肉食はちょっと強がってやっぱおごっちゃうみたいな。
そうですね。自分から話題振らないかなっていうのは思いますけど。
全部に対して受け身のような気がします。
ちょっとコミュ障？緊張しちゃって自分が思ってるようなことを口にできない。
なんかやっぱり草食系の人はそのデートの場所とか、その決めるのが優柔不断だったり。
日本人の男性の何割が草食系だと思いますか
？3割。6割。
30% ぐらいじゃないですかね。
6割くらいだ。
6割そんなに？
だって今さ、20代のさ、男性でさ、恋人いないの半分以上だよ。マジ？
実はですね、アンケート調査によると、20代の男性の 61% と30代の男性の 70% が、自分は草食系だって言ってるんですけれども、ショックですか？
多い。男性から来てもらった方が嬉しいっていうか、自分からいけないからあんまり。
20代 70%？ なんかもう俺年だからもう無理かなみたいな。
そういう系なんだ。
ちょっと待って。それってやばいですか？正確な数字だと思いますか？それともやばいと思いますか？
でもそれぐらいじゃないですか。そうだね。はい。現実的。少子化が進むよね。みんな結婚できる。
みんななんかもう一人で。
びっくりですね。
それって正確な数字だと思いますか？
いや。
So there you have it, another little report into the phenomenon of herbivore men in Japan, men who are not so masculine, perhaps a little bit feminine, and certainly very different from the samurai of previous generations. Now, there's lots of debate, lots of discussion about Japan's low fertility, and typically you hear people like me talking about the fertility for the country as a whole. But in fact, Japan's fertility varies greatly across the country. About 1.4 was the national level of fertility, the number of children that each woman has on average. But in fact, in Tokyo, the fertility rate is lower than that, 1.2. And in Hokkaido, a poorer part of the country, 1.3. Kyoto, another big city, 1.3. But the fertility is actually quite a bit higher in areas like Okinawa, where it's at 1.9. Okinawa is, of course, the islands in the south of Japan, which are pretty much the Hawaii of Japan. Shimane, another rural area, 1.7, and Miyazaki, 1.7. So just looking at these figures superficially suggests that Japan's city life is not conducive to having a family. And of course, there are obvious reasons for that. The cost of living in cities, the pressure of living in cities. In fact, the Okinawan women, from the islands in the south of Japan, they tend to marry younger, have children younger, even though their workforce participation is similar to Tokyo. Okinawans seem to have a better work-life balance and work less hours. And so what it seems is that Tokyo, as the world's biggest city and Japan's most densely populated area, is less conducive to raising a family. Now, for evolutionary biologists, people like Charles Darwin, the low fertility of Japan and of many other countries in East Asia, Germany, Italy, and so on, it's a strange thing. According to Charles Darwin, life is all about survival of the fittest, survival of the best. But what we see happening in the world is that the richest, most prosperous, most educated countries and people have low fertility. So we're not seeing the survival of the best, the survival of the fittest. Now, there are many economic challenges that come out of the low fertility in Japan. One point is there is a succession problem for family businesses. This is important for the economy. In Japan, we have many family businesses, and typically what used to happen was that a father who was in charge of the business would pass the business on to a son or son-in-law to manage. But now we have 1.4, sometimes 2 children in a family. Maybe there is no one in the family who is well placed, well trained to be able to take over a family business. This is a big issue in Japan because what happens to a family business when the owner, the manager, is too old to run it? If he can't pass it on to another family member, he has to sell it. Or what is happening is some businesses are just closing up, even though they are profitable. Now, the government is very aware of this issue and is trying to do things to save family businesses from closing up. Another issue, which we'll look at again later on, is the future of Japanese agriculture. The average age of Japanese farmers is 67. And of course, in the coming years, the average age will increase. What is the future of Japanese farming with these aging farmers? I actually see a positive scenario for Japanese agriculture. And that is that as we see Japanese farmers getting older and older and unable to carry on the farms, this provides an opportunity for robotics and other technologies to be implemented in the agricultural sector and raise the productivity. But we have to wait for this to happen and see if it really does happen. Another thing is that there are many abandoned houses and abandoned villages, ghost houses, ghost villages in Japan, and as a result of the declining fertility and declining population. Now, it's fun to travel around Japan and see these cute little old houses and cute little old villages where there is no one anymore. But as a village is progressively abandoned, again, we can have big social problems, because what happens is that maybe you have just a few old people remaining in a village for a certain period of time. And over time, what happens is that the shops are closed up, the schools are closed up, the hospitals are closed up, the doctors leave the town. So you might find a few old people living in a little village with no social services at all. And so this can be a big social problem. And lastly, I'd like to mention, and this is not a joke, there's a rising number of car accidents in Japan caused by elderly drivers. So I have here an interesting little YouTube for you about Japan's aging drivers.
Emiko Takahashi has been driving for more than half a century, but at 73, she's in an age group of drivers in Japan who statistically are now the most deadly on the road. So now Emiko and others like her have to take refresher courses in driving if they want to stay behind the wheel.
If I can stay healthy, I would like to continue driving until I become 85, just to run short errands at least.
Statistics show people aged over 65 were responsible for nearly 1,000 deadly crashes in Japan last year. That's more than a quarter of the annual total. And that led to demands for action. Authorities have since introduced laws forcing drivers over the age of 75 to have their driving ability tested. Many regions have also tried to encourage some of the 4.8 million drivers aged over 75 to hand over their license, even offering deals for cheaper funerals and discounts on ramen noodles, along with cheap travel on taxis and buses. But giving up the steering wheel is not always an option for some. Takahashi has to drive her husband to hospital every day. Despite the reliability of Japan's public transport system, experts say it doesn't always meet the needs of the elderly.
Even if you live in Tokyo, you would still feel inconvenient without a car in the suburbs. And in regional areas, you wouldn't be able to make a living without a car.
But some say the rules should be stricter.
Driving requires physical abilities. So no matter how clearly you think in your head, your body has to respond first. If you cannot pass strict testings at a training school like this, then you have to accept it.
It's estimated by 2060, nearly 40% of the Japanese population will be over 65, a so-called silver tsunami for Japan, and one that might mean the end of the road for some drivers. Christine Pirovolakis, TRT World.
So a serious problem that Japan's elderly drivers, elderly population, behind a rising number of car accidents in the country. So what to do about Japan's demographic drama? How do we increase Japan's fertility rate? Overall, Japan needs to have more family-friendly work environment so that women can combine work and family life. They need to have family-friendly work environments so men can contribute to home and family life too. And also we need to have a situation where young people can actually afford to get married. And this trend towards irregular work on irregular low-paid jobs is bad for fertility. Now, there have been many, many efforts in the past, but to little effect. But even if today we could solve Japan's fertility problem, that would not have immediate economic effects for another 20 years or so. Now, as we're looking at Japan's demographic drama, we have to recognize that there can be some benefits of demographic decline. And the obvious thing is that for the environment and for congestion in cities, if we have a smaller population, the effect on the environment, the effect on global warming will be less. And of course, if we have a lower population in cities, this would reduce crowding too. And if you ask Japanese people about Japan's demographic decline, some people will tell you they are happy to see a smaller population. There are just too many people living in these small islands. Another positive aspect of Japan's demographic drama is the so-called silver economy, the economy of silver-haired people. And obviously, many people, many seniors are in fact able to spend money on holidays, on entertainment, on traveling and so on. And also they're spending money on healthcare. So there is a whole silver economy. There's an economy surrounding the aged people. So that brings to an end this overview of Japan's demographic drama. And this really is, looking ahead, the big issue facing Japan. Japan has an aging society, a declining working age population. This all goes back to Japan's low fertility rate. And so in the many of the classes that we'll be doing later on in this course, we'll be looking at how Japan can respond to its demographic drama. And of course, there are many things that we'll look at, like womenomics. Is giving women greater opportunity in the economy and society a way to compensate for the demographic drama? Is increasing migration into Japan another way to cope with Japan's demographic drama? Is having more robots instead of people a way to do this? So there are many issues for us to look at, and let me repeat again, Japan's demographic drama is the big issue facing Japan. So thank you once again for passing this moment with me. If you have any questions, comments, reactions to this, I'd be delighted to hear it. Of course, in the middle of January, when we have our student discussion sessions, we can talk about these issues together. But for the moment, let me say sayonara.